Hello, welcome to the Agent of History podcast. I'm Joel, and whether you're listening to the podcast or watching the video on YouTube, welcome back to this journey of exploration into these two questions. How did we break and how do we heal? Here you'll find interviews with guides who can help us through the terrain we need to explore in order to uncover and develop answers to these two questions. And I'm hugely excited and honoured to introduce today's guide, who is Professor Jason Moore. Jason is an environmental historian, historical geographer, and professor of sociology at Binghamton University in the US. He's the author of the much celebrated book Capitalism in the Web of Life, author more recently of Anthropocene or Capitalocene, Nature, History and the Crisis of Capitalism, and with Raj Patel, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. Jason's books and essays have won numerous prizes, and he also coordinates the World Ecology Research Network. So as I say, it's not for any reason that I say that I'm deeply honoured and excited to introduce Professor Jason Moore, and I really hope you enjoy this wonderful conversation. Jason, welcome to the Agent of History podcast. It's a real honour for me to have you here, and welcome. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Such a pleasure, Joel.
Thank you. So as you know, this is a journey, and I'm sharing this journey with others who want to come on it with me, and it's a journey of exploration into these two questions of how did we break and how do we heal. So let's just dive straight into it. Jason, how did we break? And go answer that in as you will.
Well, the break of what? I think the most common break that we get from environmentalism isn't really a break at all. It's a kind of tale from the fall, a tale of the fall from grace, from Eden. And somehow the essentially rapacious human nature that is within us all then goes out into the world and creates havoc, whether through war, through breeding and lack of moral virtue, as Thomas Malthus would say, or through some other mechanism, man the tool maker, that necessarily it's in our nature to produce tools, and therefore the technologies that are unleashed on the world create unprecedented devastation and crisis. And there are a whole lot of problems with that, but even in that description, you can hear, if you're listening, you can hear what's missing. And what is missing from that is not just the question of class, but of how class societies are themselves ecologies of power, profit, and life in very different ways. So the class society of the Egyptian pharaohs, very different from feudalism, very different from Han Dynasty China, very different, of course, from capitalism. And so part of what I and others in this world ecology conversation, which, Joel, is very much about, I love how you put this, is very much about how did we break and how do we heal? Mm-hmm. And I think so often we forget the healing moment of this, that a revolutionary politics of climate justice, of planetary justice, is about healing as well as rupturing. Mm-hmm. And so for me, I'll try to keep this short at the beginning. For me, much of what I've been arguing is that in order to understand the specific character of today's climate crisis as a trinity of the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, climate apartheid, turns on how we understand its origins. That is, to answer your question, how did we break? And of course, the we is not all of us. The break was very specific, and it occurred through the Colombian invasions following 1492 and the creation of a capitalist world ecology on both sides of the Atlantic that forged an absolutely devastating and violent, but also productive form of transforming the web of life and the relations of power, of domination, of accumulation, of class, of politics within that web of life. And that's what we call capitalism. So in short, how we understand planetary justice today has everything, and I mean everything, to do with how one locates the origins of planetary crisis. If one locates the origins of planetary crisis with the steam engine and fossil fuels in the early 19th century and excludes everything else that was going on that made that extraordinary movement of industrial revolution possible. Then one ends up with a very, very different kinds of politics. And if one starts with the English and Dutch agricultural revolutions, the sugar enslaving revolutions, the audacious revolutions of land and life and profit that occurred in the centuries between more or less 1450 and 1750. And so that's an important place to begin. Whether you know your history or not, there is always at least an unconscious historical periodization about the origins of planetary crisis in play.
Wow. So what I'm hearing there of fundamental importance is that what we have to understand, and this is, materialism, historical materialism, we have to understand we're talking about systems of relations of reproduction. Because what you're saying there, for example, if you say, oh, well, everything went wrong from the steam engine or whatever it is, then that's a technological politics or a technologist politics that then ultimately obviously means that we can come up with technological solutions. So we broke with the wrong technology and we just got to deploy the right technology, the right policies, and we'll all be fine. And that, of course, is a way of thinking and doing that maintains rationalism, maintains the Cartesian dualism, the separation of the mind and body, and all of these other, dualisms that I'm sure we'll speak about. But coming back to it, what you're saying is no. We need to understand history from this perspective of relations of the reproduction, the systems of reproduction. The systems of relations of reproduction. And understanding them in their historical context and trajectory is really, really vital. Because if we don't understand where we came from and how we broke, we certainly won't be able to understand and practice how we heal. Is that?
Oh, absolutely. And what you're highlighting is so fundamental and so frequently ignored by radicals, but also by mainstream critics of environmental change. This question of reproduction. And I often like to say that the climate crisis is a crisis of reproduction, and calls for a reproductive justice strategy in an expansive way. If we understand that the biosphere itself is of course, fundamental, existential moment of the reproduction of life on this planet, and then we look at the ways in which capitalogenic, that is, driven by capital, climate change is inducing a fundamental state shift, abrupt, irreversible, and fundamental in the climate system, then we begin to have a sense of how the colonization, the capitalization, the appropriation of unpaid work from women, nature, and colonies across all of these different zones of reproduction, delivered by humans, of course, overwhelmingly by women, but also the unpaid work of extra-human nature of the biosphere as a whole is so fundamental. And one of the ways to conceptualize the material, but also the cultural, ideological, political violence of capitalism is essentially an ongoing relationship of extra economic appropriation of all sources of reproductive work, which is largely unpaid. Although, you see various moments of the capitalization of social reproduction, privatization of that in late capitalism. You see elements of highly capitalized commodified agriculture. But really the main thrust of what capitalism has done is move to frontiers to find new sources of unpaid work, which is essentially to seize upon the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature and channel it politically, legally, culturally into the cash nexus, into this weird and perverse, absurd system of endless capital accumulation.
So, what you're saying there is really that capitalism is now obviously a planetary scale, a system that survives and thrives through the exploitation and expropriation or appropriation of all of these sources of what you call work energy. And we can talk about, because it's for those who are not familiar, then we could talk about the work of Karl Marx as very much focused, but we'll also talk about the ecological element of Marx's philosophy as well. But Marx is obviously most famous for theorizing surplus value. That is what we understand as profit is the surplus value taken from the wealth from the labor power, from the minds and bodies of human beings. But of course, I'm just breaking this down basically for those who want so people can really follow us, which is that the feminist critique of that is that all of that is underpinned by the completely free unpaid labor that gets the workers to the factory, to the office in the first place, without which the sphere of social reproduction in the household that falls upon the shoulders still tragically to this day disproportionately of women. And then finally an ecological critique would be, and then there is the energy derived, whether it's from the fossil fuels or the raw materials from Mother Nature herself, that without which again capitalism can go no further. And in your work, of course, you document these historical epochs in which capitalism, colonialist, imperialist capitalism, expands into a new territory, strips that through the most horrific, unspeakable violence, strips that territory to the point of exhaustion, both human and non-human exhaustion, and then is able to rejuvenate itself or go again through a successive waves of expansion, colonialist expansion, essentially.
Well, Joe, that was a fantastic summary. And let's see if we can maybe break them down, and I'll try to answer it maybe in smaller parts, and then we can do the dialogue. So after reading the groundbreaking work of Marxist scholars like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett, I began to read Marx in a fundamentally different way. And just as in full disclosure, I don't think Marx was right about everything. So I'm not here to say Marx came down from the mountain with Das Kapital etched on stone tablets. But one of the things that these two great thinkers, Paul Burkett and John Bellamy Foster, did was to insist that Marx's historical materialism was fundamentally about human relations of power and political economy within the web of life. So, in other words, there was not an ecological moment to their analysis, but rather the class moment was already ecological or socio-ecological. And that's hugely important. Now, one of the major themes that you just outlined in that outstanding summary is the question of the frontier and how the production of surplus value, that is the specific form of surplus wealth under capitalism, takes shape. And Marx has a wonderful chapter that is actually one of the more readable chapters in Capital on the working day. I teach working class students and they can all vibe with it. They all resonate with it in one way or the other. But Marx poses a fascinating question here that relates directly to the question of crisis, of limits, and of frontiers. And what he asks is, why is it that the capitalist treats workers as essentially disposable? Why is it that the capitalist tends to work the worker or put the worker in deadly situations? And here I want to underscore that his model for this thinking is the plantation proletarian, who is absolutely a proletarian. And Marxists, as well as race reductionists, have not done us any favors by recasting the plantation slave as not a proletarian. But that's his model. And then he's looking at England in the early 19th century and asking, well, why is it that industrial firms can work their workers to death? Well, he has a very simple answer, and it has two moments. One is the coercive laws of industrial competition, which is more or less a direct quote. So in other words, they're under a compulsion to do this whether they like it or not. But really he has a more fundamental answer, that dynamic of capitalist competition is possible because capital, through empire, can draw in physically uncorrupted, that's his term, physically uncorrupted by capital, physically uncorrupted labor, human nature, from the colonies. Of course, his example is Ireland. Mm-hmm. And let me just add as a footnote that Marxists, but especially British Marxists, have universally ignored English and then British imperialism in Ireland as a fundamental moment of the so-called transition debate, of the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And that's reflective also of a blind spot amongst Marxists who come from the rich countries, which is, it's what they call the Marxism of the rich, and they don't want to deal with imperialism. Well, in an era of climate crisis, above all, we have to have an understanding of imperialism and how class war and class struggle from below occurs throughout the worldwide reach of capital, but also of these dynamics of what I call appropriation, accumulation by appropriation, which essentially says that a fundamental moment of endless capital accumulation and class struggle occurs in and around the domain of socio-ecological reproduction. So the question of so-called women's work, in fact, the definition of women's work, which goes back to the era between 1550 and 1650, think Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, that is part of the geocultural revolution that relates to not only the formation of a working class, but also the formation of what you highlighted, this civilization-nature divide, society and nature, the Cartesian split.
Mm-hmm. Wow, so there's a lot there. So I'm starting to hear these divides and these splits, and obviously fundamental to the work of thinkers who have taken Marx, or drawn out the ecological element of Marx's philosophy and political economy, is this dualism that is front and center, which is known as, this is Marx's words, which is the metabolic rift.
Well, he doesn't actually say metabolic.
Oh, I can't remember now.
The passage.
No, you're right.
Well, sorry to be a geek here.
Mm.
Yeah, he does mention metabolism. Yeah. He does talk about an irreparable rift in an interdependent social metabolism, which is very different. Rift in English means something different from rift in German.
Oh, well, maybe I could just introduce it, and then you could elaborate on the linguistic angle there. Okay, so in the literature, it's come to known as the literature on the metabolic rift, and as I understand it, there's this fundamental separation that occurs through processes of proletarianization, essentially kicking people off the land into the towns and cities, and literally breaking the direct relationship that we have with. Now, I do remember this quote when he talks about our. Does he call it our internal and external lungs as well? Is there that as well?
That sounds about right.
Yeah. So essentially, we have that relationship, obviously, with the trees, but also the metabolic rift. Feeds us. We consume the food. We excrete the waste that feeds the earth. In the most fundamental, material, physical way. This is broken. But of course, that's just it on a physical level. So that's how I understand it. And maybe you could share the insights of the German term and maybe take it from there.
Well, I think the German term is more kind of riven in the sense of an alienated unification. So just as an alienation is sometimes described as the separation of the direct producer, the peasant, from access to the means of production, the land. Of course, that alienation, that separation, is also a unification. That's very important from the point of view of a dialectical oneness, which Marx, again, makes very clear in the opening 100 pages or so of Capital, where he says that what we are looking at is the relations of man and man and man and nature. So he's saying that these are operative simultaneously, unevenly, asymmetrically. That's very important to remember, because to the extent that one can identify capitalism's victories in controlling parts of nature, it is at the cost of the middle and long run conditions of unpredictability of the web of life that is, of course, underscored by the climate today. That capitalist modes of controlling particular parts of nature do not work for the totality of the planetary web of life, or at least the biosphere moment of it, which is shaped by all sorts of orbital variations, solar variations, and all the rest. So this question of metabolism is really fundamental, and unfortunately it's been very confused by the specific defenders of a very, very narrow theory of what's called metabolic rift of John Bellamy Foster and his colleagues. So they've really gone to the mat defending a very, very formal definition of this. And I think that it misses some of the greater insights that Marx offers, and that indeed are suggested even by Bellamy Foster's work, which is quite rich and extraordinary. That what we are seeing on the one hand is capitalism's project, the bourgeoisie's project to remake the web of life into a set of profit-making opportunities. So this is what I've called the project of cheap nature. And cheap nature always contains a double moment that I think is a kind of Marx and Gramsci synthesis. And that double moment is, on the one hand, capital, always with empire as its handmaiden, is to aims to create cheap labor, food, energy, and raw materials, or the conditions for those that are necessary for every great wave of capitalist expansion. So these four cheaps, labor, food, energy, and raw materials, have to be reduced in price to the capitalists in the imperialist centers in order to launch and initiate a new great wave of accumulation. This was spectacularly the case for the British in the early 19th century when Britain became the workshop of the world, but also earlier for the Dutch, who were, in Marx's words, the classic, or the model capitalist nation of the 17th century. So there's a price moment, but integrated with that is an ethico-political moment of geocultural devaluation and degradation. This is the question of the world color line, of globalizing patriarchy, and of all manner of Christianizing, civilizing, and developmentalist projects from the days of Columbus all the way through Truman into the neoliberal Washington consensus. So if only you as the downtrodden, as the wretched of the earth, will become Christian, will become civilized, will become developed. In other words, if only you accept that and work hard enough, everything will be okay. And we know that's not true. Now, that's the project. And the project is always in confrontation. The project presumes that we have one zone of civilization, of development, of Christianizing projects, and then everyone else, including most human beings, peoples of color, women, Slavs, Celts, Africans, indigenous peoples, go on down the list, are not really members of society. They are members of nature. The better they can be cheapened in this double sense. All right, now the contrast to that is the metabolic moment, the metabolic arrangements and the metabolic flows of capitalism, which are very physical, identifiable, and are not only enabling short-run booms of capitalist production like sugar plantations, for instance, in the 17th century, but also creating new problems for capital. And this is what I call the progressive activation of the limits to capital, the progressive activation of what I call negative value, that is, barriers that cannot be fixed within business as usual under capitalism. And this is the web of life as process, capitalism as a process in the web of life, where the web of life is throwing up increasingly insuperable barriers to capitalism's business as usual. Of course, the climate crisis is the classic moment, the apex of this long-run 5-century development.
Wow. So I think it feels like every time you end what you've been sharing, I say wow. But I'd like to bring it for a moment really into the real world, and I wonder if I can give an example, and we can look at this example to reveal everything that's behind. And behind which everything you've just said, it comes out. So the other day I went to my local greengrocers, And at the moment in this country, do you enjoy asparagus? Is that a thing in?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, sorry, because I was just told it.
Lots of you got to have vegetables.
Yeah, well, no, I just meant that there are certain places that they don't really eat asparagus. Like in Ireland, apparently asparagus isn't much of a thing, right? Anyway, so it's asparagus season at the moment, right? And I get to the shop, and there's a bunch of locally produced asparagus coming from Somerset or something like that. It's £4 or £5 a bunch, which is a lot of money.
Oh.
For the same price, you can get 2 bunches of Mexican asparagus. Okay, so that's a real world example. So I wonder if you could respond to that example by saying, let me say how that we can understand that through my concept of the project of cheap nature.
So that's a great question.
And if I may add, the cultural, racial element and the patriarchal element that obviously dehumanizes the human beings involved in the production also.
Right, it's an excellent project. And the first thing that we can note is that the project of cheap nature doesn't mean cheap for you and I. It means cheap for capital, from the standpoint of capital. Mm-hmm. And that's why Raj Patel and I, in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, call cheapness a battleground. Cheapness is a class struggle that, in the widest sense of the term, that understands these dynamics of racialized, engendered, and imperialist super-exploitation. So super-exploitation involves a lot of different dynamics, but one of them is to ensure the maximal appropriation of unpaid work, but also to suppress the wage rates for the segments of the working class that are created through racialized and gendered structures of domination. That's very, very important. So what came to mind, and this is maybe not what came to mind for you, but what came to mind for you is, for me, as you were sharing this, is the extent to which big E environmentalism, mainstream environmentalism, as it took shape after 1968, and especially after the first Earth Day in April 1970, is that mainstream environmentalism has essentially told us that we can buy our way to salvation, and has spread the idea that capitalism is a kind of consumer plebiscite, where the consumer is sovereign. It's very interesting because even liberal economists, left liberal economists in the 1960s, like John Kenneth Galbraith, the senior, had thoroughly blown up the theory of consumer sovereignty. Environmentalism, mainstream environmentalism, resurrects that with a vengeance after about 1980. So in the core of the formation of neoliberalism. So we have this mentality that if only we buy our way through virtuous consumption, which is a very Malthusian idea, by the way. Of course, for Malthus, virtue was fundamental, and the working classes were incapable, more or less, of virtue. If only we buy our way to salvation, then everything will be okay. Of course, we know this after 4 decades or so of so-called organic agriculture, that it does not, and that organic agriculture in the official sense, and I don't know what it looks like in the UK, but in the US it's highly regulated, highly certified. Organic agriculture is in every respect big ag. It's big agriculture, just without some of the chemicals. And we want to keep our minds open to the idea that mainstream environmentalism has in many ways enabled the neoliberal project. And through the sponsorship of virtuous consumption in various forms, has in fact reinforced the drive towards planetary crisis. Now, from the beginning, there was a working class environmentalism. Today we call working class environmentalism environmental justice, and that's advanced a very different kind of social movement strategy and political project. So we have, I think, in this case of those who can afford the asparagus at 4 or 5 pounds, a case of professional workers, relatively affluent professional workers, who form the social base of mainstream environmentalism can go to the market and feel good about buying paper straws and organic, locally produced asparagus and all the rest.
Yeah, but yeah, I don't want to get in debate about the asparagus, but I guess I was wondering in terms of like just getting your head around how can it be that asparagus coming from, because there's one element with, of course, which whatever our vision for, and we can come on to how we heal, then of course one element has to be that our food has to be produced much more closely to home and has to travel far less miles, not least because it tastes better when it does. But I'm just I was wondering whether we can very briefly maybe just look into that, just how we can get our head around the fact that we can get twice as much asparagus for the same price. And it's coming from so far away. And I guess what my mind turned to was, obviously far lower labor standard conditions, environmental conditions. Obviously if it's Mexico, predominantly brown people doing the labor, highly gendered labor in certain ways, and obviously the denigration and the dehumanization of the people involved in those practices, that it can make it in any way possible that can be the case.
So this is usually talked about in the language of what the great Tim Lang calls food miles, and that is an extraordinarily useful concept, and also, if we leave it there, an extraordinarily limiting concept, because it essentially becomes a form of the 1970s Big E environmentalist slogan, think globally, act locally. Well, that's a slogan that's entirely consonant with neoliberal rule. We need to, of course, break out of the local in order to forge solidarities of working class struggle across the world to enforce environmental justice in this wider inclusive sense. That environmental justice is always class justice, is always anti-racist, is always feminist. So in the case of Mexico, the case of cheap Mexican asparagus, and we can go down, this is not isolated to Mexico, it extends to all manner of what Harriet Friedman and others call the new agricultural countries that formed during the early 1980s. Places like Thailand with its prodigious shrimp exports would be another example. Chile is a famous a major exporter of berries, for instance. So this was the direct outcome of the imperialist bourgeoisie's restructuring of world life and world class relations in the 1970s and 1980s, that was achieved through, as Naomi Klein and many others have shown, was achieved through prodigious violence. And then once the violence of the states backed by imperialist countries, especially the United States, pacified the populations, then market rationality could take over. And so the case of Mexico is a poster child for this, where, as David Barkin, among others, have shown, Mexico pursued an extraordinarily successful strategy of food self-sufficiency, of pioneering peasant agriculture around the ejido system, of all manner of basic grain, maize production, but also with vegetables and all manner of other necessary foods to, nourish ourselves. That was forcibly broken up through the debt crisis, which involved an imperialist restructuring of Mexico's economy with the connivance of Mexico's super rich at the time, to essentially open up and extrovert the economy. So in this case, and you rightly keep pointing to this confluence of imperialism, racism, sexism, class, all together to produce this cheap asparagus. So what you have here is indeed the creation, through a worldwide class war from above, of super exploited labor that can then be reproduced and put to work in berry production, in asparagus production, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, as you note, heavily feminized work at the same time. So this is very important to move beyond the usual environmentalist tropes of ecological footprint, of food miles, etc., which narrate the problem as more of a technical problem, like if only we just grow food locally, everything will be okay. Well, that would probably help, but we have to understand that we are looking at capitalism, which requires a cheap food regime. And so, exactly as you indicate, the cheap asparagus is the product of cheapening in price, the wages, the conditions of doing business, but also cheapening as in devaluing the lives and labor of the workers in agricultural fields in Mexico. But also, we don't need to go to Mexico. We can go to Watsonville, California, or many other places in the United States.
You know, this is amazing. It reminds me of a project from former colleagues and friends of mine at Warwick University, which is the political economy of everyday things. And you know, it's just blown it open there, and just reminded me about how, you know, I'm thinking about the as you said, the debt crisis of '82. I think that was the peso crisis of '82. You know, which came about through basically raising interest rates, which then made loans that were given by American commercial banks to third world dictators, unredeemable or unpaybackable, and the cost of these, of course, the cost of this huge debt was of course not borne by the banks who lend profligately, but by the backs of the poorest people in the world through imposition of the IMF and the World Bank of structural adjustment programs, which basically, as you said, smashed open their economies, destroyed all of those, as you say, indigenous and more kind of self-sufficient practices and programs that were in place, smashed open those economies and those societies, took huge amounts out of their welfare systems, out of their healthcare systems, out of their education systems, and created the conditions for projects for cheap labor, cheap food, cheap energy, and cheap raw materials. So it's a real reminder of that history lesson for me. But I'm mindful of, we've kind of come to the halfway through, and we've got this juxtaposition at the moment. So we've got this, you've mentioned the phrase quite a few times, the web of life, and in your book you call it this Greek term, the Oikeios, and so there's a starting point is an understanding of the oneness of all life, of life itself, the web, but the web, though it is made up of countless nodes, is one. So what we're talking about, you know, and this really comes into like what my interests are, is that all of these dualisms that are necessary on an intellectual level, but on the most material level as well, but also on the level of, dare I say, our very hearts and souls, of these separations, of these breakings. And in your work, of course, is this a critique of the dualism of the separation of human and nature, or society and nature, or history and nature. And all of these are essential. So fundamental to the question then of how we broke is fundamental to these ripping apart, these separations that have been forged by capitalism, and then kind of also intellectually and culturally imposed on our psyche, on our very souls.
So these everyday life terms that we use, anthropologists call them folk concepts, and that's a really, really good way to describe nature and society. We treat them, or we tend to treat them, as very innocent concepts, innocent descriptions of the world around us. Of course, when we push on it, we understand that nothing about society is apart from the web of life, and very little about the biosphere today is really separate from so-called society, although, of course, there are quasi-independent sort of laws of nature. Laws of nature themselves change. The orbital variations of the Earth or volcanic eruptions are not caused by capital. That it's important to keep to engage in a critique of these everyday life concepts, these folk concepts. It's been far more comfortable for the left to do this around race and gender, sexuality, even class, than it has around the question of nature. Now, the reason why every great liberation movement insists on a new vocabulary, a new conceptual vocabulary. We can think about this around feminist and anti-racist and sexuality movements and all workers' movements, revolutionary anti-colonial movements. They all insist on a new vocabulary because they understand that the received vocabulary, these folk concepts, are not only bad descriptions of the world, but practical instruments of rule and domination. And nowhere is this more clear. This is the hidden history of capitalism that even environmentalists don't want to touch. The hidden history is that this ideological separation of what was in the 16th century called civilization and savagery. These are precisely the terms that the English used to talk about, well, what? These are the terms they used to talk about and to inform the English colonization and devastation of Ireland, especially after 1541. Now, what's going on in 1541? It turns out quite a bit. The coal mining revolution in northern England, the intensification of agrarian capitalism, but also Kett's rebellion in 1549, rather, where they take the second largest city in England, Norwich. So this is a moment at which the expression beyond the pale forms. That is, beyond the pale was the colonial line around Dublin, and beyond, within the pale were the civilized Englishmen. Beyond the pale were the Irish, who were variously described as wild and savage. And so the reason why I'm telling you this story is to understand that the question of dualism, of society versus nature, is not merely a question of semantics. It's not a question of semantics at all, really. It's not a question of finding the right concepts to talk about the modern world. It's a matter of identifying the practical guidelines of imperialist rule and class formation in the modern world. As I remind my students all the time, the first thing that the Europeans discover when landing on the shores of a new land is they discover just how lazy the inhabitants are. That is, they need to be schooled in civilization, whether it's the Christianizing project of the Spanish Requerimiento in 1513, or the civilizing projects of the French and the British and the Americans in the 19th century, or the developmentalist projects. The message is essentially always the same. You are not civilized, you are undeveloped, uncivilized, unchristian, and work will set you free.
What you've done there is, you've really reminded me in quite a humbling way, actually, that a mistake that is so entrenched in me that I will make it many more times in my life, which is thinking about this dualism of humanity versus nature. Of course, my instinct is to bring all humanity on the inhumanity side of that. But what you're really saying is, no, this project discarded the vast majority of humanity onto the savage nature side of that dualism. And that humbles me, actually, to have to be reminded of that. And that's truly appalling, of course. Mm.
And so this is very important. This is a bit of an academic term, but I think it might be useful for many people not in the academy who are deeply concerned with planetary justice, is that one would no more talk about race and gender in 16th century terms, which were practical instruments of domination, than we would talk about civilization and nature and society in 16th century terms. And yet, that's precisely what many of us are doing. And as a recovering Cartesian myself, I would say, yes, indeed, the recovery is not something that just happens, but an ongoing process. In a way, we all need a 12-step program for overcoming our addiction to Cartesian language, not because of the language as such, but because to name the world and to see the world from the standpoint of society versus nature is to see and think like an imperialist, like a slave owner. And I don't say that lightly. I don't say it lightly at all. And I don't say that with a kind of moral judgment because, like I said, I still struggle with the violence of alienation and this kind of language which separates. It's not just a language; it's a way of thinking. It's a way of seeing that gets in under our skin, gets into our intellectual DNA. And so, how do we overcome that? Of course, is linked to very deep matters of practical politics, but is very important.
Well, let's go there in the last 15 minutes or so of this conversation. How do we overcome these separations? How do we overcome these dualisms? And well, we began this conversation by saying, if you want to know how to heal, you've got to know how we broke. So this is an implicit way of saying, well, we need to think dialectically. That's how I understand this. So maybe we can have that conversation, how we, maybe by obviously pointing to movements that are already begun, how we begin to overcome these dualisms, both politically, culturally, socially, ontologically, spiritually, and of course, very materially, very, very materially and politically. Big question.
Well, yeah, it's a great question, and I think we should be honest about the history of the left since 1968. The social movements that have emerged have been, in many ways, so creative, so dynamic, so encouraging of heterodox thought, and at the same time have often reinstalled supernatural objects or sacred objects at the heart of their politics. So for mainstream environmentalism, it's the sacred category nature. For anti-racism, it's become a metaphysic of racism that's always existed. For gender, we know, as Nancy Fraser points out, that feminism became entirely congruent with the main thrust of neoliberal politics. And of course, there were radical class-based counter-movements to all of those all along. I think, so environmentalism is a great example. On the one hand, it holds to a certain philosophical love of the oneness of life. At the same time, it tends to deny especially questions of capital and class in the making of planetary crisis. That's why environmentalists talk about anthropogenic climate change when they should be talking about capitalogenic climate change. That the climate crisis is very much the product of empire, capital, and the bourgeoisie over the past 5 centuries. So that's something very difficult to wrestle with. I think the other very uncomfortable element is the destruction of a political left across the world, not everywhere, not evenly. Of course, in Latin America, there have been vibrant political movements that have understood that in order to pursue social justice, a strategy of state power is necessary. And that raises uncomfortable questions for a lot of reasons. It raises uncomfortable questions because the neoliberals have largely won the ideological struggle and convinced the rest of the left that realizing state power is probably not necessary. You can just leverage social power to affect differential political outcomes and changes in policy. That's been a failure. But at the same time, we can't denigrate these social uprisings that we've seen from the Arab Spring, Occupy, very factory takeovers in Argentina, many other heroic grassroots struggles. The question is, how does one forge a political strategy out of that? Now, all of this is further complicated. I'm just complicating this, and I'll end it here so you can, end what I'm saying here so you can come back at me. But the other part of this story is that we are in the midst of the end of the Holocene. That is, the end of the climate stability, the unusual climate stability of the past 11,700 years. And in every previous moment, far milder moments of unfavorable climate change, but in every major moment of unfavorable climate change over the past 2,000 years, we have seen significant moments of social and political unrest and even civilizational crisis. This was the case with the fall of the Roman West in the 4th and 5th centuries. It was the case with the demise of feudalism in the 14th and 15th centuries. Climate didn't cause those, but climate, because it's really woven into the tapestry of civilizations and class society, that when the favorable climate becomes unfavorable, it's like pulling a thread, and the whole sweater all of a sudden is on the floor in just a bundle of threads. So that's as good a metaphor as we have for what's going on. So to be sure, on the one hand, there's not going to be any seizure of the White Palace moment or storming of the Bastille moment, because we're looking at a planetary civilization. So it will involve a lot of what we've seen in previous civilizational crises, that is, the fracturing of worlds, just previously just worlds unto themselves, like the Western Mediterranean and Northwestern Europe, or feudal Europe, which was not all of what we call Europe today. So we'll have these moments in which modernity's politics as usual will no longer sustain. And I think that we're seeing that, and I think the form of it is a kind of emergent blood and soil ethno-nationalism that seeks to use borders as weapons in the international class struggle. So there's a lot of complications here about how we deal with all of these.
Yeah, there really is. I guess I'd like to bring it back in one way to the first page of Capital, which is introducing the way that we experience the world in our capitalist society as through the commodity, and the commodity being made up again of a separation. And this, for me, this separation is like a kind of the slowest ever nuclear fission. That this breaking of the atom, splitting of the social atom, and the commodity is made up of a use value, this value that we value because it actually satisfies needs that we have, or at least we're convinced that it will, and the exchange value that it can be used to trade, to generate profit for its owner. And I'm just wondering if we could look at ways of relations of reproduction that attempt, consciously or otherwise, to bring this social atomization, social breaking back together, to basically, in plain English, to reject exchange value, to reject trade, to reject money, and to produce, consume, exchange, distribute according to the law of use value, and basically, working to meet one's own needs through the satisfaction of others, and others working to meet our own needs. So, I wonder if how you'd respond to that, if that seems to be fundamental.
Well, I think that this is a conversation in progress that's so important to have. And we have two major possibilities or tendencies within a broadly defined left today. One is to take everything that you said and turn back to a kind of very romantic peasantism. So let's all go. It's a version of Back to the Land. There's a right-wing version of this, which is on display in the recent work of somebody like Bruno Latour, in talking about the Earthbound, which is a return to blood and soil, although dressed up with a lot of other language. But there's a left-wing version of this, which has a lot of traction within food sovereignty movements, and a kind of yearning for very, very good reasons, a yearning for that kind of reconnection to something called the land. I think that that's dangerous. And I don't mean to say that there aren't very, very positive and liberatory elements of that, but I think that romanticism is in a kind of politics of nostalgia, almost in a way, is very dangerous. On the one hand, and on the other hand, there's a kind of Marxist futurism that everything can be automated and then the problems will all be solved. And that does a bit of a disservice to the nuances of that argument. So just like with food sovereignty and other peasantist perspectives, with the accelerationists and the Marxist futurists, there's something very, very important to that. I don't think that I have the answer of all answers to your provocative question, but I would say that because of the legacy of imperial anti-communism, we have been blinded to, I think, a form of healing that will be necessary to any revolutionary politics of climate justice, which is the experience of reconstruction. And if we look at the history of World War II, where one communist state and another communist political movement dealt the decisive blows to two great fascist empires, and then proceeded to reconstruct countries, China and Russia, which together were, a fourth of the world's population, proceeded to rebuild, and I mean in the most dramatic sense of rebuild, reconstruct cities, agricultural systems, political systems, everything. These were countries that had been razed to the ground. Now, I'm not here to be the defender of the heroic Soviet Union or Chinese socialism. It seems to me that there were all sorts of contradictions that are endemic to the capitalist world economy and world ecology in those projects. But the Chinese succeed in raising life expectancy over the course of about 30 years, from about 35 to 65. Whatever you want to say, that's a crucial moment of healing. With the Soviet Union, you see again the rebounding of life expectancy. Yes, it ended up going south in the 70s. That's a different story. But in terms of post-war reconstruction, the Soviets built more housing units than any country in human history, and not a small thing. And so when we're looking at what will come next, you could throw Cuba's experience with the end of cheap Soviet oil into the mix too, with its agroecological revolution. I don't want to be nostalgic about those experiences either. I think we should not. But we should look at the reconstruction moment, because in the era of the unfolding climate crisis, we know one thing for sure. Virtually all the cities, for instance, on the coastline of the eastern United States, will have to be moved inland. So literally, cities will need to be rebuilt, electrical grids will need to be rebuilt, transportation systems will need to be rebuilt. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the politics of that? And we know, and we can see this in the Green New Deal, there is a tendency, not for the militants, not for the activists, but there is a tendency to allow the Green New Deal to become a kind of massive government subsidy for green energy, and for the profit of those energy companies. But there could also be a popular working class New Deal that would democratize these moments of reconstruction. So we need to play around with the messiness of the state socialist experience with really sober eyes, and not with the eyes of the the old defender of the Soviet Union, or with the ideas of and the orientation of the imperial anti-communist.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that answer is very much focused on how we might rebuild and repair materially. But I think like the most radical revolutionary element is really in the relating, because we started this again in you couching Marxist philosophy as a philosophy of how humans relate with humans, and how humans relate with non-humans, or therefore in its entirety how life relates to itself. And that's what brings me in this I guess this word healing. And so a lot of that is how we come to relate to each other and see each other and ourselves, our very selves, not as commodities, ourselves,
right,
and as full expressions, beautiful expressions of life, of the Oikeios, in all of its messiness and complexity. So, is there, I guess I find myself on the kind of liminalities or the peripheries of academia because of this, like. How we bring that in? Because I see you nodding your head, so like you agree with me that there is a relational element here, a spiritual, emotional element, how do we bring that into our politics? How do we bring that into our practice? How do we bring that into the academy? Can it be done?
Well, it's a revolutionary project because you're talking about overcoming another dualism, that is, of spirituality and intellect. This is one of the reasons why I enjoy somebody like Cornel West, who has long made the argument that Marxism fails to radically internalize the revolutionary spiritual dimension of liberation. And of course, we're dealing with a very, very potent dualism where you have all manner of so-called New Age spiritual healing that has explicitly distanced itself from revolutionary politics. And on the other hand, we see revolutionary politics and, of course, intellectual-centric college university professors say, no, it's not about spirituality at all. That's just a bourgeois fantasy. That's clearly not true, because the violence of alienation is not only bodily, but spiritual. And what that means, and what a revolutionary spiritual project that takes seriously a revolutionary class project of planetary justice, what that looks like involves both this not backward looking, but it involves going back to all manner of pre-capitalist spiritual traditions that, of course, always rejected dualism. Only modern Christianity and other modern religions that get reinvented after that come to invent, say, these theological categories of heaven and hell, right? Heaven and hell don't exist for pre-capitalist Christianity in the way that we understand them today. It wasn't this hard and fast binary. So we have, I think, a moment, an opportunity really for a spiritual awakening that is also an awakening of a revolutionary class consciousness in the Marxist sense of the term, which is to engage in a project to abolish class society. But that also, and you rightly keep pointing back to this, is that involves a new spiritual orientation. And in this sense, I know this is going to sound very silly, but but I think that there's something to it. That again, in the socialist experience, the insistence on variations of a new socialist man and woman were in many ways modern, hyper-modernist and developmentalist and all of that. But it wasn't completely wrong, because what it insisted on was a rupture with the older ways of thinking of oneself, of thinking about one's role in society, of thinking about the contributions one can make to the society at large. And we've seen many other instances of this around the world. But the crucial missing link to everything that I've just said is politics. And again, both New Age and many social movement leftists retain a kind of neoliberal sensibility that they don't want to touch politics, that they will leverage either individual spiritual growth to achieve some spiritual awakening, or the leveraging of social power. And here, Marx and Lenin were absolutely right, that the class struggles are resolved at the level of politics. And so how do we bring politics into our spirituality and our spiritual healing? Seems to me the fundamental question. And I think the answer, what do we do? Well, we do exactly what you in this podcast are doing, Joel. We open up space so we can see that it's permissible to say, yes, I'm a Marxist, and I also have a spiritual commitment to healing, to oneness, and all of that.
Yeah, that's really beautifully put. And I just would like to just make one final remark and an addendum to that, which is that us as the embodiments of these dominant subjectivities, ourselves as white really privileged men, one reason for this platform is that I really want to hold conversations that may be very, very difficult with those who have been the objects of the most horrific and brutal violence. Not least indigenous communities who have always held on to that unification of spirit and matter and political life. And there's just immeasurable wealth of learning and knowing that we can open ourselves to there.
But that's a good example of also the fractures that are unfolding, because in the recent decades of indigenous struggles across the Americas, often against extractivism, which have been heroic and necessary, there's always been a fracture within those indigenous communities that's a class fracture. And there's always been a stratum within indigenous communities to align with petrocapitalism, to align with extractive capitalism. My favorite example of this is that in the early 1970s, on the day that Leonard Peltier was at Ruby Ridge in a shootout with FBI agents, the chief of the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation was in Washington, D.C., signing a deal for a new extraction project. And so we also want to be aware that in the recent wave of indigenism, and we see this with invocations of settler colonialism, there's an attempt to assert a groupism and a race reductionism that's actually practically violent to the kind of revolutionary solidarities that we want. And that are so needed. So we need to look for the lessons, but we want to avoid romanticizing certain versions of indigenous politics that ultimately come down to a kind of blood and soil environmentalism from below. This time, not a fascist one, not an imperialist one, but from below. And the answer to blood and soil environmentalism is not more blood and soil environmentalism. It is the forging of class solidarity politics. And that has been very challenged by elements of the left these days who want to say, no, it's groupism, and that everything is about race in a metaphysic kind of way, in an explicit rejection, again, of the class divides within black communities and the arguments of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who did not argue that it was all about race, who said it was about super exploitation and a class struggle. So this thread becomes very difficult because we want to look to these traditions of oneness from indigenous peoples, but but we don't want to romanticize that.
Yeah. You know, it's such a pleasure being exposed to your mind, Jason, because it's like kind of towards the relentless critique of everything, but it's so essential because you're absolutely right. You know, Native American populations or indigenous populations are absolutely as exposed to class and gender and other structural divides as anybody else. So I just appreciate that that critical. Because underneath all that criticality, because it can sound like, geez, he's just critiquing everything. But actually, you know what it is? It's love. It's love because you want to get it. It's an absolute commitment to accuracy, to really fully understanding, because we want to change. We want to change things for everybody, and we want everybody involved. So actually, it sounds like it's not. You know, it's not. It's a million miles away from pedancy. It's nothing egoic. It's actually coming from a commitment to a politics of love, and that's so. I'm just so. Unless you want to come back, you come back on that. But otherwise,
no. You said it perfectly. A revolutionary politics of love is one of the most vexing questions of our times.
Yeah.
And you just said it beautifully.
Thank you very much. So. So grateful for your time. That was a real tour de force through so much, and maybe you can come back a year or two from now, and then we can have a look at hopefully how things are changing for the better. But in the meantime, I'm just, for one, have been really inspired by your work, and so keep on keeping on. Thank you so much.
Well, Joel, thank you so much, and thank you for opening this space for these kinds of difficult, vexing conversations that are so urgently needed.